Drive Time Dialectic. Once again, I'm not really driving, but I am in my car, so we're just going to go ahead with calling this a Drive Time Dialectic. So, John Brown Civil War. Yeah. Um, why would I bring up John Brown right now? And what would be the 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 depth of something like John Brown and our current cultural climate here in the US? So, as many of you know, John Brown has been in the history of the United States. John Brown has been hailed as a hero for the abolitionist cause. And, for those of you that don't know, abolition, of course, was the movement to eliminate slavery from the North American continent, from the Republic, which I think was a great movement. I mean, I'm an abolitionist myself. I believe in an abolition of slavery across the world. It's like chattel slavery still exists in the world today. And I'm also an abolitionist when it comes to abortion. I believe the best thing for human flourishing would be the elimination of abortion, period. Um, so I can empathize with the desire of John Brown to have slavery abolished. However, as I have pointed out time and time and time again, I don't think the United States needed to fight a bloody conflict to eliminate slavery. And the reason that I say that is we have the historicity of the end of slavery in Europe, especially Great Britain, to show us that there was no need to shed any blood to end slavery. Great Britain did it through legislation, through law, through cultural reform, and that was led predominantly by Christians, and not just any Christians, predominantly by Reformed Calvinistic Christians of the day. And men like John Newton and William Wilberforce were able to do that. Here in the United States, of course, we fought the bloodiest conflict that the United States has ever fought on our own soil to end slavery because it needed to end, I guess. And not I guess, it did need to end, but for some reason, we decided the only way to end slavery was by murdering thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And we're supposed to be okay with that. But, and the biggest problem was the lead up to the Civil War, which I hate even calling it Civil War. It was not a Civil War, didn't meet the definition of Civil War by any stretch of the imagination when you actually understand what a Civil War is. Now, John Brown is kind of hailed, like I said, as a hero in that fight. I take a drink. I'm dry today. Coke Zero, by the way, cherry Coke Zero, really good. No sugar, no carbs. I don't know how they make it good. It's probably not good for me. But what we don't really concentrate on, and here's the issue with John Brown, is that he had a good motivation, the end of slavery, abolition of slavery. He had a motivation to see black men freed, black men and women. Can I say that anymore? Can I say black men and women? I don't know. Can I say men and women? Because this ties in to Nashville. And he was a Christian, in which what I think makes his actions, in my determination, John Brown's actions were exponentially more evil because of his Christianity, and even more adversarial and even more wicked because he was Reformed. He was Calvinistic. He was, kind of came from that evangelical Calvinistic background, And there again, I believe it drove him to be an abolitionist, but it also then his abolitionism overtook logic and drove him to be a violent man. And it wasn't just the raid on Harper's Ferry that was violence for him. That was a violent act. His raid on Harper's Ferry was designed to seize the weapons that were at Harper's Ferry so he could form an army and go and fight and take on Southern slave owners. He wanted to murder them. And you could call it whatever you want, but that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to murder Southern slave owners. He believed he had that authority, that in his drive to free black folk in the South, he could murder anybody that he wanted to murder. You could call it whatever you want, but it was murder. But he believed he had that right because he had already done that in Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas era, when Kansas was in its own form of violent civil war within Kansas. He led the abolitionist forces against the pro-slavery forces, and on several occasions, and in one occasion alone, he and his men made war on another group, and they murdered over 20 and wounded 40 more. So John Brown is single-handedly responsible for the deaths of dozens and dozens and dozens of people. Whether he personally took their lives, people that he had command of, he were taking the lives of these people. And in some cases, he murdered children, young men. Now, the way we define young men today versus how they define young men back then is clearly different. And I know that's going to lose some of you. But as an abolitionist today and a non-aggressionist, I abhor the idea of using violence to end abortion. Just like I would abhor using violence back then to end slavery. I don't think you're morally right to murder somebody because you want them to stop something that they're doing, even if what they're doing is wrong. Now, if they come at you to do violence to you, or you catch them in the act of murdering someone or physically assaulting someone in that regard, then yeah, use violence. But I do not believe that initiating violence against someone who's not initiating violence on you is wrong, which is why I oppose the idea or even the reality of people who would blow up abortion clinics. That's evil. You don't do that. You don't assassinate abortion doctors or abortion providers. You don't do that. That's evil. That is absolutely evil. No matter what your purpose is, it's evil. Now, what does this have to do with Nashville? So many people talk today that we're on the cusp of a civil war, or we are in a civil war. And that's true. I believe that we are. And because so many people also have this idea that civil war is these two sides that have clearly drawn lines of militarization, and you have the East versus the West, or North versus South, and you have this like the Mason-Dixon line, whatever you want to refer to it as, that this is a war and these two armies are going to meet. Historically, that's not what a civil war is. Especially in the modern world, civil war doesn't look anything like what we picture it as in the United States. And I agree, we are definitely on the cusp of a civil war. Some of you say we're already there. I would say we're not quite there yet. I believe we are on the brink. We are so close to being on the brink. But I'm going to make a comparison. You go back to Nashville on Monday. You go to Covenant Presbyterian, ironically a Calvinistic church, and apparently a conservative Calvinistic church. Not, more in line with PCA versus the PCUSA, or the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, but apparently a conservative leaning, and yes, there are left-leaning churches in the United States, folks. Don't think that everybody who claims to be Christian is not a leftist. This is apparently a conservative-leaning church. Covenant Presbyterian was attacked by an activist. No matter how you look at the individual who did it, Covenant Presbyterian was attacked by an activist. A John Brown type. And we're seeing that ramp up. The rhetoric is ramping up. Violence towards people who do not agree with the ABC agenda is ramping up. And like there again, I mentioned in the video earlier this week that we have Representative Lee Fink. I don't know Lee's original name. I don't know their dead name. But Representative Lee Fink here in Minnesota is, forwarded and advanced and got passed through the House of Representatives in Minnesota. Trans sanctuary legislation has stated that there is a genocide happening against trans people in the United States, demonstrably untrue. The rhetoric is happening now to come out even louder and louder and louder that the trans community is under attack and they need to now start taking action to end that threat. We are seeing the buildup of trans versions of John Brown. It is coming. The John Browns of the trans community will start preemptively doing violence more and more and more. And I'm not saying that states shouldn't be taking action to protect children. I do believe that they should be passing legislation to protect children. I don't care if a public library or something wants to hold a trans-friendly event. The First Amendment allows them to do that. I think there should be restrictions on things that can happen in those situations. Sexualization of children should not be taking place. But they should have the freedom to have an event, right? Just like a Christian should have the freedom to have an event at a public library or at a public school then. If you're going to have these trans-friendly events in publicly funded places, they need to be open for anybody to have an event in publicly funded places. There again, there should be restrictions on sexualization and whatnot. Now, as this legislation passes, and we just saw today, the Tennessee Capitol was overrun by leftist activists. Overrun. And it was about, as best as I can ascertain, trans issues. There will be an uprising or an increase, if you will, in people taking John Brown type tactics. And that, to me, is where we're on the cusp of a shooting war. You could say, well, it's here already because there's already been shooting. And there have been numerous incidents across the United States over the last several months where non-binary, trans individuals have done violence, just like there have been instances in the history of the U.S. where right-wing people have done violence. The difference is now is that the ideological divide is being driven in such a way that if you disagree with trans ideology, much like with John Brown, his ideology started out sound and solid, but it became cultic in how he was approaching it. It was, you do things this way or you're not part of the crew. You're not part of the group. You have to do this or you cannot be part of this. That's exact same thing that's happening now. Like with the trans ABC community, if you disagree, you are a threat to them. And when they see you as a threat, when someone sees you as a threat, it makes it easier for violence to be done against you. Saturday is supposed to be the Trans Day of Vengeance. Supposed to take place in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court on the steps there. Many of us would have a desire to go and observe or even counter protest. Something like that. Not me. I'm not driving to Washington, D.C. for something like that. Protests and rallies have kind of, just to be honest with you, I've lost my taste for them other than documenting them, because what you see is a lot of rah, 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 and a lot of people standing around chanting slogans and ultimately never actually being an activist by showing up to meetings, council meetings or county commission meetings or school board meetings. It's just a lot of people that go to these things, get their battery charged and feel like they've done something. But we have to understand that what's happening in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court on Saturday, on April 1st, and no, it's not an April Fool's joke. This is a real event that they're putting on. They might be foolish for doing it, but what we see is a buildup of division and tension. And as I've tried to point out to people all the time, if you look at this as strictly from a left-right perspective, you're a moron. Because there are people on the left who disagree with the ABC agenda. Just like there are people on the right who disagree with some of the agendas we see from some of the far-right extremists. There are people on the right who disavow racist ideology. And so we cannot lump all these in together. But what's happening with this buildup of otherisms, where we are forced to see people as enemies, it's going to make it easier for people to do violence. It will absolutely make it easier for violence to be done. And that's why John Brown saw Southern slave owners not as fellow human beings, but he saw them as others. He saw them as less thans, and it made it easy for him to do massive amounts of violence to them. It was okay for him to drag people out of their homes and murder them. It was okay for him to raid a federal arsenal in Virginia, because what he was doing in Harper's Ferry was justified because those were others. John Brown saw those people as others, less thans. And when our rhetoric is such that we mock and make fun of people who are different than us, who have a different point of view than us, we're othering them. And when we other them, they will other us. And when they other us, it makes it easier for a divide to grow. And instead of coming together and not being driven apart by left versus right spectrum ideology, but recognizing that we can have differences of opinion without violence happening, we will then resort to violence. We will, because we see them as different. And someone who's different, it's a form of xenophobia. Someone who's different than us, other than us, is easily seen as an enemy. And when you see an enemy, anything they do is a threat. And when you meet a threat, the best way to end a threat is violence. And that's horrible. That's a horrible perspective. John Brown was wrong, but so was the person in Nashville on Monday. They weren't just mentally ill. They were wrong. They weren't evil because they were part of the ABC community. They were evil because they murdered people for their ideology. This is the cusp of the Civil War. We're causing this. We're causing this because we've got people out there with big voices and big platforms that all they harp on is, oh, these people are dangerous. These people are psychotic. These people have mental illnesses and yada, yada, yada. They're not dangerous because they're different than us. What's dangerous is the divide we're allowing to happen. And instead of having conversations, we're dismissing them and saying they're too crazy to talk to. I won't deal with them. That's where the violence is going to come in. That's where the violence happens. And so many of you are okay with it. Well, I would never do violence. No, you might be the victim of the violence because you maybe, just maybe, you've allowed yourself to be conned into taking part in the left versus right argument. Because the regime wants that. Mainstream media wants that. They thrive off of that. And have you ever thought for just a minute that there are people out there who maybe you have a lot of philosophical differences with, but you might be able to ally yourself with in a cause to bring peace, to have some conversations to say, where can we find a middle ground on this? Your problem is you see everything as left versus right. Many of you are John Browns, not heroes. You're potential terrorists. Many of you. Because you may say, I would never do that, but I can understand why someone would. And I don't care if it's a left-leaning perspective or a right-leaning perspective, and that's my left. If you're watching, it's different. But a right-leaning perspective. If you think for a minute that saying, I would never do that, but I can understand why someone would, somehow makes you better, you're crazy. You're allowing division to happen because you don't know how else to handle it. More than likely, you don't know how to handle it because you never spent any time intellectually, reasonably, and logically delving into it and trying to understand their positions. All you do is red herring and straw man arguments to dismiss them and think that they're all crazy because they don't agree with you. That's why the Civil War is going to happen. Because you're causing it. You're causing it. And I have critiques of the left big time. But I understand them because I'll talk to them. Most of you won't. So unless you want to see more John Brown type violence happening in this country, you better pull your heads out of your collective philosophical asses and start talking to people you disagree with. Open the door for conversation. Because if you don't, we're in for a lot of trouble. And it's going to come faster and faster and faster. And you'll have no one to blame but yourself for being suckered into the left versus right spectrum argument. Deal with it.